everybody. I'm very happy to have this opportunity to present some of my work.
Excuse me.
I would like to start with some more introduction to tell you more about who I am, because I think that's the first time I meet so many of you. So as Marcin mentioned, I'm a PhD candidate at Wrocław University of Technology, and I did my master's in spatial planning, but I was also studying language studies. The specialization was Roman languages. I did it at the other university in Wrocław, and that influenced very much my field of interest. Also, the way I see spatial planning in urban context. So I'm very much interested in local communities, local cultures, top-down governance and communication, conflict management, and everything that can go with it. I also have some experience because I've spent several years during my, parallelly to my PhD studies, focusing on practice. So I was participating as a facilitator. I was running public consultations in Wrocław and several workshops on community building as well. And now, at the moment, I'm just about to start. Actually, I'm starting my 2 years of program that is funded by Polish Ministry of Science and Higher Education, called Mobility Plus. And what I'm going to do here is comparative studies on public involvement, tools in the relation and the relation between citizens and local authorities in perspective of communication. This is a broader topic I do my research on, but today I would like to present to you a piece of my work, which actually is content of my PhD thesis. It is, it's more narrowed, and it's a case study of one city, and my aim was to evaluate the effectiveness of the current needs recognition of the citizens by local authorities in the context of urban transformation. So it's nothing more than communication between local authorities and citizens in urban transformation context. So the fields that influenced me and that are very important in my research are, of course, cities and citizens' needs. How does a city satisfy citizens' needs? Also the communities, types of communities and their role in space transformation, the relation between communities and space. Of course, public participation itself, deliberative planning, or things like urban interaction design that are becoming very catchy nowadays. But I also, using my linguistic background, I'm also influenced very much by communication theory. So the main hypothesis in my research is actually the approach to public involvement as to communication. And if that's the case, then it can be also analyzed as the normal regular communication act with the use of tools that linguistics is offering. Main questions that I put in my thesis and I'm trying to answer are what are the public involvement means used in Wrocław, so communication means between citizens and local authorities. What is their frequency of use, also effectiveness? What are the most frequently used, what are the most frequently used from the perspective of communication, and what are the main difficulties regarding that. Also, I'm trying to, following the communication approach, I'm trying to answer how does the communication tool relate to the dominating communication function. So if it comes to methods, they may not be very sophisticated, but I'm trying to keep those things as simple as possible. So my starting point was interviewing 24 local communities council representatives, and I had the interview's topic was about their communication with local societies, with local communities, and what are the main difficulties. Another approach and methods I was using was just simple statistics with the use of hard data, the qualitative, the numbers, how expensive, how often, how many people were involved. But the biggest part of my methodology is coming directly from communicology, and it's a communication act analysis. The very basic one, just to start with it. So probably most of you have seen it in high school, the model of communication, the very basic one where you have a sender and a receiver, and they are transferring message in a certain context using a certain channel or channels, and with the use of a certain code. So what I'm trying to point out is that within the Communication Act between citizens and local authorities, any public involvement act, you can actually also see those elements, and then it's easier to find where are the weak points. So that would be that's the way I see the public involvement. Not only public participation, not only the very active, let's say dialoguing, interactive situations, but also the situations when we have a flow, one direction flow of information. This is also communication. And to bring it closer to urban and a city context, each of those elements we can see here can be translated into city elements, or the reality elements in public involvement. So then the sender and receiver, that's pretty obvious. It could be local, it could be single citizen or citizens as a community. It could be a representative of local authorities. Both of them can be initiator of this information flow, of this contact. The code here is, as I will explain in a bit, is a very problematic issue, because many misunderstandings and many problems are exactly here, are placed here where the code is, because the language is very often not sufficient and it doesn't allow both sides to communicate in an effective way. But there are different types of code that can be used and that it's being used between local authorities and citizens. It can be a common language, it can be a professional language, it can be infographics, pictograms, symbols. It can be also the language that is developed in a certain part of the city, like kind of slang or dialect. The channels that are used, the information, the contact is being sent through, are the tools that city can use to interact with the citizens. So, such as media, such as participatory budgeting, consultations, and so on. The message is generally about, on one side, about needs of citizens, their expectations, but also demands, warnings, protests. But on the other hand, from the local authorities' perspective, these are local plans, projects, realization documents or strategies. The context is about space, of course, and it can be defined space, like we have a local plan and it has its borders, very strict ones. But it can also be a part of soft planning, so it doesn't actually have a certain and defined space, but it also creates a context. But it's generally placed somewhere within a city. And of course, the type of contact can be direct or indirect. So it also influences the shape and the tools, and also the code and other elements. What I've found very interesting in my research is also the functions of communication. In the language, we can find 6 dominating functions that can be defined within a communication act, and it depends on what's the purpose and what's the most exposed, more what's in the spotlight in the communication act. It can be emotive or connotative. I'm not really sure if I've translated everything properly, because I was basing on Polish literature here. So I hope I haven't I tried my best. I haven't made a mistake. But it's more about explanation. So emotive or connotative functions are when the communication act is focused on a sender or receiver. If the whole communication is about the sender and its aims and its, let's say, emotions, it's about, or in this situation mainly aims, it's the emotive. If it's more focused about discovering and stimulating the receiver, we can say about the connotative function. And of course we have expressive or impressive function, where expressive is more about, well, following the name, expressing the statement of the sender, while impressive is when sender is trying with its communicate, with its message, trying to influence the receiver. We have also a function which is more informative. It's about just transferring the information from about the context. It's just without any expressive or impressive function hidden behind. These are 4 functions that actually can be pretty easily shown in communication between citizens and local authorities in terms of public involvement in city transformation, city development. But there are also 2 other functions, which is a meta function and phatic function, that hardly exists in this relation, this communication between citizens and local authorities. And that might be a hint that this communication is not it's not complete, and maybe something is missing, as these 2 functions are shown by the linguists that as very important ones in the communication act. So this is my theoretical part. Before I go to the case study of Wrocław, I would like to mention briefly about the Polish context if it comes to public involvement, because it is very much different than in Western European countries, because we are still kind of feel the previous system, the previous that Poland was part of Soviet Union, and of course there was no such a thing like bottom-up government. Everything was strongly centralized, and things like citizens' initiatives simply didn't exist. So that changed after abrupt collapse of Soviet Union in 1989, and very pretty quick. After 5 years, there was a first planning act introduced that was also introducing some means that were allowing citizens to comment on local plans or local development project and strategies. In 1997, our new constitution ensured a right to be involved in public ventures, that people had finally have a right to comment, and finally had a right to be involved, and their initiatives were allowed. And also several years later, a new Spatial Planning Act was introducing some public involvement as obligatory. So before local plans, which are the most common planning documents in Poland, are being introduced or realized, it's obligatory to organize a kind of consultations with the public. Nowadays, it's not done yet, but nowadays there is a huge debate about going even further with this, to make it obligatory to answer to every remark that local authorities get on local plan, because nowadays they are not obliged to answer to all of them. So now let's go to Wrocław. It's one of the biggest Polish cities. It's capital of the Lower Silesia region. It's about 600,000 inhabitants. It's a very vivid city with many universities. It's going to be a capital of culture, European capital of culture in 2016. And it's very well known in Poland because of the participatory ventures that are taking place there. There are many tools that were implemented from all around the world, participatory tools that are being used in Wrocław. But nobody would say that it works perfectly, that the communication is effective. So that's why I was, as I mentioned before, I was interviewing some of the local leaders, some of the representatives of local councils, and I was asking them a question: what's the problem with the communication? Why, when you're working on a local plan, why it's so difficult? So there are two main groups of problems they were pointing. First is exclusion, and the second one is attitude. If it comes to exclusion, there are also different types of this. It can be physical exclusion because of time and space. Well, not everybody can travel from one side of the city to another in certain hours to talk about local plan or other ventures. It's also, if it comes to the very common procedures, it's usually 2 weeks after the first version of a local plan is announced it's 2 weeks to react. So it's also kind of limited. And also to be able to react, you have to be able to understand what the local plan is about. So the second problem of exclusion is actually a problem of language, because just recently, just this year, somebody mentioned that maybe we should prepare documents in Wrocław Development Office that are more achievable and that are understandable for citizens. Because before that they were using the language of local plans, which is a very professional language, which has their definitions that might be a bit different than in common language. And also the last part the last kind of exclusion is actually exclusion via procedures, because to raise your voice, to take a part in a debate and a discussion, you need certain skills. Well, one thing is that in Poland, citizenship skills are an issue. That's a problem, and we don't have them developed very well. But another thing is to take a part in a discussion, to involve in a debate, to make a remark for a local plan. There is a need to use a very certain professional, very strict language, and also to use an adequate form for it. So that also makes it very difficult and unapproachable for many people. The attitudes are actually very much related to our lack of citizenship skills, because there's no relation, like a real relation and a trust between local authorities and citizens. So there is a lot of aggression, there is a lot of indifference, and people don't feel that they belong to the society. They don't feel a part of the city, and they don't feel that they can do anything about it. So they're not really willing to participate, and they are not interested because of that. But it's changing. You can see that step by step there are more and more initiatives, and people are more and more interested, showing more and more of their interest in what's going on in the city. There is still an issue of lack of trust to our government. So this is also an interesting phenomenon that now when they are finally getting active, they want to do everything by themselves. So that might be a reason why one of the tools, which is participatory budgeting, that was introduced 3 years ago, is so very much inclusive. I mean, these percentage are showing which part of society, starting from 15 years old, are actually included in a communication via those chosen means. So of course the media, I put them all together because it was impossible to, I didn't find a way so far how to divide those means. So media are still the most popular ones. So 70% of Wrocław inhabitants and citizens are can reach the information, can find the information, receive the information from TV, radio, local press, posters, billboards, flyers. Another one is participatory budgeting, and that's a pretty interesting phenomenon because within 3 years it became extremely popular. So 50% of inhabitants actually did vote this year, and that's comparable with the presidential election, actually, the frequency. so any other elections aren't that popular in Wrocław. There are also the other tools are remarks for local plans. Only 9% of Wrocław inhabitants did it that way. Internet platform. There is a huge internet platform funded by European Union in 80%. It's called Dolny Śląsk, so not very catchy name, but it consumed a huge amount of money, and they used very sophisticated tools. They have interactive local plans there, interactive maps. You can have this augmented reality and really many fancy things, but only 7% of people are actually using it, of Wrocław inhabitants. And that's not the case of access to the internet, because Wrocław is one of the, let's say, best connected and very much online city, which like 90% of inhabitants have access to the internet, at least at
May I
work.
ask, what's the population?
600,000 inhabitants in Wrocław. So the tool is not used that much. Well, our local authorities believed that it might be a very useful and powerful tool to make debates and to interact with the citizens, but it's been there since 5 years already, and nothing happens actually. There's also, of course, a well-known public consultations and debate series, depending on the project, depending on what the city is working at the moment, but it never go higher than 2% of people in total if we make an amount of people who took a part within the whole, with all meetings that were made during the debate series. Which is what's very visible, but actually not that inclusive, are NGOs initiatives, and also citizens themselves are being active lately. And there are several cases in Poland when they are these two types of interactions and communication managed to change the decision of our president, the mayor of Wrocław. One of the example was an island in the middle of the city, which was a public space, green area, green zone, used by many, without any inhabitants, used by the all citizens. And the city decided to sell it and to build a hotel there with some services. So there was I would say, a riot, and it was present everywhere in media, in newspapers, on the streets. But in fact, it was if it comes to people that were actually involved, it was just a very tiny percentage. So how I'm trying to analyze those tools and to show where the problems are, where are the weak points, is actually to I've chosen just the two of those tools because it's pretty descriptive analyze, and I was to show where are the difference between different tools if we treat them as a communication. So I've chosen participatory budgeting, and I've chosen the remarks for local plan. So if we talk about context, we can easily notice that in participatory budgeting it's a whole city, and the projects that can be made within it can be both soft planning and basic infrastructure. If we're talking about context in if it comes to the local plan, It's all about the boundaries. It's all about certain space that is it's very strict. And the language that is used within a participatory budgeting process is actually a phenomenon itself, because it already there is already a developed language because of the participatory budgeting. People are introducing names, giving in names of the part of procedures, and it's a vivid one. It's something completely different than we can see in those formal procedures where you can write a formal letter. You have to refer to certain parts of the documents, and there's no space for spontaneous expressions. If it comes to the message, the participatory budgeting collects real needs and expectations, and also is showing a bit how Wrocław citizens are like. What do they like? What do they want? What's their imagination? And on the other hand, again, local plans or remarks for local plans are usually protests or remarks, and very, very, very precise and very detailed in a very, very small scale. If it comes to channels, participatory budgeting uses it all. There is a very small trigger from the side of municipality, which is the moment when they are when they are promising how much money going to be spent on participatory budgeting, and then it lives its own life. So it's present everywhere in media. It's present also in the internet. It's present also between people, among people, in public transportation means. So it's living its own life, the information itself. If it comes to the way that the message and the communication the message goes and the communication look like, as I said, it's a very, very tiny and very delicate trigger from, if it comes to participatory budgeting, from the local authorities side, and then the most important part of information goes, and the contact goes between citizens to local authorities, and of course then they are responding with a realization. But that's the strongest part of the communication here. If it comes to this formal procedure in remarks for local plan, the strongest contact is actually the information from the local authorities side towards citizens, and there is a very, very little space for a reaction. So it's hard to talk about exchange actually of approaches, exchange of information, and satisfying citizens' needs. It's when I was talking about functions. It's actually, I hope it's noticeable for not only for me, that when it comes to participatory budgeting, we have very, very much of this impressive function, but not from the local authorities side, but from citizens' side. And if we are coming to the local plans, then the citizens are actually just being informed, and all the actions around are to influence them in a way that the space going to be shaped without their actual involvement, maybe sometimes. In all those tools, there's no space of there's no room for fatigue function, which is which might be very important in this relation between local authorities and citizens, as this is actually the maintenance of the relation, of the contact between two sides of the communication that are communicating. If I would like to explain what does the fatigue function do, is when I would meet one of you at the corridor, I would say, hello, we don't have to talk about anything. One may say that's not information at all, but that's a fatigue function. We make a relation, we make a contact. Without that, it's really hard to discuss something. So going from this to public involvement in the relation between citizens and local authorities, I find that this might be a part that's missing in this relation. So there's no kind of established contact. It's not a process. It's not a constant thing. But just when something is happening, all of a sudden, two sides wants to communicate, and they don't have the proper circumstances for that. It's also something that I would maybe add, or I don't have a picture here, no, of the ladder of participation of Arnstein. It's there are different types of different advanced levels of advancement if it comes to public participation. But I think there is something even beside that before you start talking about public participation, maybe there is a need to establish a contact before. So my conclusions would be actually questions. What is the what is important in communication between citizens and local authorities? Is it the language, actually? Well, if the improvement of the language could be made, would that solve every problems? Or is it something about the context? Maybe it should be always very strict, not blurred or with soft boundaries. And is it possible to manage public involvement by using certain paths of communication in certain moments? So maybe the improvement can be made by choosing a certain tools at different stages, depending on how intensive interaction we need. And of course, what about missing functions, like the fatigue one? So just maintaining the contact. So that would be all. Thank you.